Welcome back to our Tuesday session. Today I have Willie, who's going to talk about one of the very hot topics on AI ethics. Um, Willie, it's all yours. Feel free to take that up.
All right, thank you. So happy to be here. Really looking forward to presenting these ideas this evening, or for me, this morning. So let me start off by just giving you a general overview of what this talk is going to be about. So my goal today is to present an actionable framework for AI and machine learning practitioners that'll help you know better how to incorporate critical ethical thinking into the design of the algorithmic systems you're designing, so as to build towards a more just and equitable future. So in other words, what I hope to present you with today is a way of structuring your thought so that you can think more critically about the ethics of algorithmic systems, the questions you should be asking, and the ways you should be responding to those questions. So I want to begin by just flagging some assumptions that I'm making in this talk. So first, I'm assuming that we're all well aware of the hazards of AI and machine learning systems. These are, scare words like bias and discrimination, racism, sexism, and the like. We know, I take it, the ways that algorithmic systems can go wrong, the sort of pitfalls that we want to avoid. I also assume that we're well agreed on the ideals that we want our algorithmic systems to promote. These are values and ideals like fairness and responsibility, transparency, and so on. I take it, though, that we don't know so well how to promote these ideals, how to actually manifest them in our algorithmic systems. And so that's what I hope to talk to you about today. Another thing that I want to flag at the start is that there's a whole AI ethics ecosystem. And although I'm going to be talking specifically to AI and machine learning practitioners, this isn't the only place that we need AI ethics to happen. These aren't the only people that we need helping out with this. So in fact, there's various levels that we need AI ethics to happen if we're ever really going to hope for our algorithmic systems to be good and just. So just to list out a few that I can think of. So we need AI ethics to happen first at the product level. So we need ethics to be part of AI product and data product design. It needs to be just sort of built in to what we conceive of as our products. Also needs to happen at the executive level. So we need ethics to be among the company's priorities and guiding what the company is doing all the way up to the C-suite. It needs to happen at the industry level. And here, what I'm thinking about is we need there to be external audits and external certifications of ethics teams. We can't just rely on businesses themselves to internally monitor and audit themselves. We also need there to be external checks. Similarly, we also need ethics to happen at the governmental level, so at the level of policy, regulation, and other governance. We also need it at the research level. There's a lot already happening here, but we need AI ethics researchers to continue to push us and to expand our vision of what AI ethics involves and requires. But last but not least, it also needs to happen at the engineering level. So this is the level of AI and machine learning practitioners. And this is the level that I'm going to speak to today. But I just want to emphasize at the start that all of these levels are essential. And we can't make AI ethics happen with only one. So although I'm going to be speaking to only one part of the puzzle, all of these parts are really needed. But since I am speaking to this one particular part, what do AI and machine learning practitioners need to help make AI ethics happen in what they do? Well, I take it that what need is not just education on the issues. I'm assuming that to a certain extent, this is already there. We already know what the hazards are. We already know what we want to achieve. But rather, I think what AI and machine learning practitioners need is a structured way of thinking about these issues as they actually crop up in the design of algorithmic systems. And this is so that practitioners can know how to incorporate ethics into that design. And so this is precisely what the framework I'm going to be presenting today aims to do. One last word of introduction, just a few words about me. So I'm a data scientist with an academic background in philosophy. So I've taught AI ethics, I've researched AI ethics, and I've also built machine learning models, and I have hands-on knowledge of what it's like to design algorithmic systems. So part of the purpose of this talk is to show you how I bridge the gap between these two parts of my background and put my data science work into dialogue with my philosophical training. Now, that being said, this talk is my personal take on how to incorporate ethics into algorithmic system design. And I don't mean to suggest that this is the one and only framework there might be for doing this. This really is a work in progress. And so I'm very curious and excited to get feedback from other AI and machine learning practitioners about this. Very excited to hear what you think of the framework, what works, what doesn't, what makes sense, and what's just confusing. So if you're here for the live stream, please write your questions and comments into the live chat. And if you're tuning in after the fact, please reach out to me. I've put some of my contact details here. Okay, so let's begin. And I want to start off by making a general point. First thing I want to address is a common complaint that I often hear from AI and machine learning practitioners. And the complaint is this: it's that ethics is fuzzy, or ethics is subjective. And this is in contrast to data science and algorithm design, which is just math and has the rigor of objectivity. Now, this complaint, I think, gets things precisely wrong. And this is not just because ethics is actually a lot more precise and objective and rigorous than people think it is. I mean, that's true. But the more important point that I want to emphasize here is that data science is a whole lot fuzzier than people seem to realize. In fact, ethics is no fuzzier than data science itself. And I think this is a really important fact to appreciate before going into thinking about the ethics of algorithmic systems. So what am I talking about? I think it would help to just go through an example here. So let's set aside all of our ethical concerns for a minute, and let's just think about what goes into designing good algorithms on a functional level. So not ethically good algorithms, but just if you've got a good algorithm, what makes it functionally good? Now, you might think that the answer here is straightforward. Functionally good algorithm is an algorithm that performs well on its predictive task. And this answer makes sense at a certain level of abstraction. It's correct, but this answer masks a lot of the other questions that we as data scientists also need to address before we can even begin to evaluate an algorithm's performance. So what am I talking about here? Well, think, for example, of the question of whether we need to optimize for the algorithm's accuracy, or its sensitivity, or its specificity, or some other metric. Now, this is a really crucial question for us to settle before we start to evaluate an algorithm's performance. We need to decide the metric on which we're evaluating it. But of course, there's no kind of one tried and true answer to this question in every single use case, right? The metric that we decide to optimize for is going to depend on that use case. And for example, whether we care more about false positives or false negatives or something else. And there's other design questions that are similarly open for interpretation. So we might also have the question of whether we want to optimize for interpretability or predictive power. And again, here, this is going to depend on what we actually want to use the algorithm to do. In many use cases, we actually want to have a more interpretable model so we can make use of it better. But in other cases, we might just care more about pure predictive power. But again, there's no one universal answer to this question. We need to think it through in our particular use case to settle it. And similarly, we might also have questions about just recognizing blind spots in our training data so we can ensure that our model will perform well in real world deployment beyond just the testing environment. Now, what I want to emphasize in all of these questions, and of course these aren't the only ones, but for these questions and others, there are no universal answers here. And it would be ridiculous to suggest that there are. Any AI practitioner that just said, well, accuracy is always the best metric for any model, doesn't understand that, in some context, accuracy really isn't what we should care most about. Now, data scientists are accustomed to working in this kind of gray area, right? Because we recognize that the key is to think about the algorithm's use case and to tailor our design choices to that. So I hope you can see that, in thinking through just these normal questions of algorithm design, there's already a lot of fuzzy territory. There are already a lot of gray areas that we need to navigate. And when it comes to designing ethically good algorithms, I think we're in a completely analogous situation. Now, we may not yet know what the right questions to ask are. That's in part what I'm here to tell you about today. But we can acknowledge at the start that there are not going to be any universal answers to these questions. But that fact that there are no universal answers to the crucial ethical questions we need to ask, that fact should not trouble us. That is the situation that we're in, but we as data scientists know how to respond to such situations. The correct design choice will depend on the algorithm's use case. So the key is knowing the right questions to ask and how to relate those questions to your use case. And that's what the framework that I'm here to present today is precisely designed to do. Okay, so I hope that maybe helps settle some questions that might be worrying some people from the start. But let's now move on to talk about this framework. And I want to introduce it first by kind of laying it out at a high level and just telling you about the structure of this framework. So here's the idea. This framework is all built on one basic ethical question that I'll be introducing in a moment. There's one basic question, but we're going to ask it a number of times. So it's going to be asked across 3 different components or aspects of algorithmic actions, and I'll be telling you a bit more about those in another minute. And it's also going to be asked at 3 different levels or strata of algorithmic actions. And so what this means is that our single question is kind of asked 9 different ways. So 1 each for each of the components, 1 each for each of the levels, crosswise. And so the result is 9 specific questions that we're going to want to ask of any algorithmic system. But again, it all boils down to one central ethical question that's then refracted across all of these different dimensions. So that's what you can expect. Let's now kind of jump in. And before I show you the basic ethical question, I first need to introduce the fundamental ethical concept on which this whole framework is based. And that concept is what's known as respect for persons. Now, respect for persons is commonly recognized as one of the fundamental concepts of morality. You may know that it is the cornerstone of Kantian moral theory. It's also one of the 3 ethical principles of the Belmont Report. But these historical facts are not so important. I'm not looking to take a stand on whether respect for persons is the fundamental concept of morality or even the most important concept of morality. But rather, I'm introducing it here because I believe it's a really powerful heuristic. It's a concept that can really help guide our thinking in new and productive ways. And that's what I'm going to be showing you here today, how it can help us think about algorithmic systems and the ethics of those. But before jumping into that, I should say a few words about just what is respect for persons, what does it involve? So here's a few different ways you might understand it. Respect for persons requires always treating individuals as autonomous human beings. That is, beings with their own desires and the capacity to make their own decisions and choices. Another canonical way to talk about it is that respect for persons involves treating others always as an end and never simply as a means. In other words, don't simply use other people for your own ends, but recognize their independent moral standing. Another way to think about it is that respect for persons tells us to refrain from certain actions and behaviors. So it tells us that we shouldn't manipulate others or exploit them or debase them. We shouldn't violate their rights, and we shouldn't interfere with their own decision-making and self-governance. So in this way, respect for persons sets what we might think of as a boundary condition for moral action. It demarcates a subset of actions that are absolutely morally wrong. And although it doesn't always dictate exactly what we should do, it does always indicate what we should not do. So it kind of sets a line that we shouldn't cross. Now, all this might seem a bit abstract at this point, so let me just lay it all out for you with a concrete example. So to take the classic one, imagine a doctor who has 6 patients. So 5 of her patients are terminally ill, and her 6th patient is perfectly healthy. Now, imagine that the doctor decides to kill her healthy patient in order to harvest that patient's organs and give those organs to her other 5 patients, and thus save those 5 patients' lives. Now, on the one hand, we can think that the doctor here has promoted the greatest good for the greatest number, right? Saving 5 people while losing only 1. Whereas if the doctor were to do nothing, 5 would have died and only 1 would have lived. Now, although this might seem like a net, net positive, a net good on that way of calculating things, nonetheless, I think this strikes us as intuitively morally wrong, right? The doctor's action clearly seems to violate some moral principle because the doctor has treated her healthy patient merely as a means to her other patient's health. So if the doctor had respected her healthy patient and recognized that patient's fundamental moral rights, so in this instance, the patient's right to life and to his own body, then the doctor would not have engaged in such morally wrong behavior. So this is an example of what respect for persons involves, requires, and how it sort of plays out in an imagined and somewhat fanciful moral situation. But this hopefully gives you an intuitive sense of what respect for persons is all about. Now, you may still be wondering how respect for persons applies to the case of algorithmic systems. But one of the things I'm going to be arguing here is that respect for persons actually stands behind and underlies those various ideals that we saw right at the start, those various ideals that we want our algorithmic systems to promote, ideals such as fairness, transparency, and privacy. So although it might not seem obvious yet, as we're going to see over the course of this talk, I do think respect for persons links up to those ideals that we were initially concerned about. Okay, so that's the central fundamental ethical concept. What though is now our central question? Because remember I said this whole framework is built on one basic question. So this question is pretty simple. It just, does this action of our algorithmic system respect the persons affected by that action? So this is the basic question that I want us to be asking ourselves again and again in all these various ways. And this question in itself might already make you think twice about some algorithmic systems. So think, for example, of facial recognition systems that are constantly watching and surveilling people, on the street or as they come into stores or even their own apartment buildings. Or think about IoT devices that are constantly listening in to people even within the privacy of their own home. Now, these systems, these algorithmic actions might already give us pause in the way they seem to invade people's privacy and thus violate their rights to privacy. And this is precisely the sort of thing that I think a focus on respect for persons can help put into focus and make us think twice about. But I do think it's helpful to not just stay at this high level, but get much more fine-grained in the questions that we're asking. Because this question of does this action respect the persons affected by it, this can be asked across several different components of any algorithmic system and at several different levels at which that algorithmic system can affect people. So that's what I want to take you through now, these three components of algorithmic actions and the three levels. And then we'll see how this question of respect plays out across each of those components and levels. So to start off, let me just introduce you to what I'm thinking of as the three basic components of algorithmic actions. So here we have our proverbial black box algorithm. And I want to now distinguish three different actions, components of actions that an algorithmic system can take. So first, you've got an observation action. And by observation, I here mean, the data collection step. And I mean both kind of the collection of the original training data and the training on that data, but also the collection of new input data to make new algorithmic classifications. Classifications then are the second component of algorithmic actions. So here I'm talking about how an algorithmic system will classify input data point, maybe classifying it as high risk or low risk, healthy or sick, whatever our algorithmic system is designed to do. And then last but not least, there's this third component that I don't think is often enough talked about, but it is really critical when thinking about the ethics of algorithmic systems. And this is what I'm calling the intervention action. And by intervention, I mean what we actually do with the classification that the algorithmic system makes. So if our algorithmic system identifies a person as high risk, say for defaulting on a loan, what do we actually do with that classification? Do we deny their loan application? Do we send it out for further review? There's lots of different choices that we can make in light of our algorithmic system's classification. But we need to be thinking about this because it's really critical to the ethics of any algorithmic system to think about, okay, what are we actually doing with the algorithm's classification, and how is that actually affecting people in the world? Okay, so those are the three components of algorithmic actions, but it's also key to recognize that all of these actions can play out on three distinct levels. So the first level is the individual level. And this is pretty straightforward, is just how an action affects a single person. So you might imagine that if your algorithmic system is observing users' browsing histories, at the individual level, that's just, okay, the observation of a single particular user's own individual browsing history. And so we can think about that action. But we can also think about actions at the collective level. And so this is how an action affects a whole population of persons. So for example, think about a voice recognition system that might systematically malfunction for voices of a certain dialect. So this isn't just affecting individual people. In fact, the system is systematically malfunctioning for a certain group of people. And to understand, the ethics and the fairness of this algorithmic action, we need to be thinking not just at the individual level, but also at the collective. And the third level I want to talk about is something more distinctive, something that is not often talked about, but I think is pretty clear enough once you think about it. And this is what I call the iterative level. And here I'm talking about how an algorithmic action affects persons when it's repeated and reiterated again and again. So think, for example, about a personalized newsfeed, and think about the persistent personalization of one's newsfeed. You might think that if you're just shown one story here and there that seems to match, that's been determined to match your user profile, well, that might not seem that bad. But if that just happens over and over again, such that the only things that you're seeing in your newsfeed are items that have been personalized to what the algorithm thinks is your user profile and your distinct taste, well, that's what gets us into these hazards of epistemic echo chambers and filter bubbles and the like. And to understand the distinct issues with that sort of action, we need to be thinking about the algorithm's action at this iterative level. So that's the point there. Okay, so that's a brief overview of these different components and levels. And so what we have now is if we combine our three components and our three levels of algorithmic actions, we arrive at this 3x3 matrix, which identifies 9 distinct actions involved in any algorithmic system. So we're going to have the algorithm's observation action, which plays out at both the individual, collective, and iterative level, and so on and so forth for the classification and intervention actions. Now, this analysis of algorithmic actions might seem illuminating in its own right. I hope it does. But remember that its real purpose here is to guide us in thinking through the ethics of algorithmic actions. And this is accomplished by asking that central ethical question of each of these 9 actions. And so one very simple way you can think of this is, okay, we're going to ask this question of, does this action respect the persons affected by it? We're just going to ask this 9 different times across all these different dimensions. But this, of course, is a bit too simple-minded. It's, I don't think, very helpful at this point. So what I want to do now is go through some concrete examples, go through each of our different dimensions, and show you in more specific and concrete terms what this question of respect actually looks like across these different components and these different levels. And I hope that will give you a better sense of how this framework could actually be used to help you think about the ethics of any algorithmic system. So to get right to it, let's start by thinking about observation actions. And to help us think about this, let's look at a particular example. And here I want us to think about a loan approval algorithm. So this is an algorithm that's going to look at applicants to some sort of lending application, a loan application, and decide whether the applicant is creditworthy or not. So maybe it's trying to decide whether they're likely to default on their loan, but it's trying to decide whether they're worthy of this loan. Now, when thinking about the observation action here, let's imagine that this algorithm is taking in a lot of data. So not just an applicant's credit history or their salary, other things that we might think are pertinent to a loan application. But let's imagine that this algorithm is also taking in data on the users, the applicant's browsing history and patterns, because the designers have thought that, oh, maybe knowing what an applicant has recently searched for or what time of day they're applying, just their clicking patterns and things like that, maybe that the designers think that's relevant to just determining an applicant's creditworthiness. Now, I think there's various problems here that we can think about, and let me lay these out by thinking about how this action plays out across those 3 different levels. So at the individual level, we might worry that some of this information that the algorithm is collecting, this would just seem to be private information. Like why should a loan approval algorithm have access to my browsing history and search patterns? Another problem alongside it is that none of this is transparent to the user. So the user might see that they are entering in certain information like their salary, but they're not seeing that the system is also looking at how they're browsing or clicking through the form. Thinking about the collective level, we might worry that even the relevant data, so even the data like credit history and salary, this data might reflect social inequities because of the fact that certain groups of people have historically been denied credit for various reasons. So this might make us worried that there are issues of fairness in the data that our algorithm is being trained on. And again, none of this might be made transparent to the user. So the user might not even know why certain groups of applicants are systematically being denied loans. And finally, at the iterative level, we might worry that if we're thinking of not just one instance of data collection, but rather years of continuous collection of data, well, this might lead to certain feedback loops in our system. So imagine if the fact that the applicant had prior loan applications that were approved, imagine if that were also a data point. Well, you could see that this could lead to some problematic feedback loops in that the fact that an applicant was in the past denied by the algorithm for a loan application could then serve as future data for the algorithm to further deny that applicant a loan. And again, another problem here is that just none of this is transparent to the user. So in thinking through the specific questions of respect, I think we can think of 4 distinct questions here. So first, there's just an overarching question. I raised this at each of the levels I was thinking about. In order to respect persons in observing them, in collecting their data, there is some requirement of transparency. And what we need to ask is that, are people at least able to be aware of the data that the algorithm is collecting? Because if we want to respect their independent moral standing, their independent decision-making capacities, they need to be aware of what the algorithm is doing, collecting on them. And then if we think about how this action plays out across each of the different levels, well, at the individual level, we want to ask, does the data collection process respect each individual's rights? And here in particular, I think we want to think about the right to privacy. At the collective level, we want to ask, does the data collection process treat all individuals fairly and equally? And here's where we want to think about inequities, and especially historical inequities across different groups. And at the iterative level, we want to ask, does the data collection process allow individuals to take an active role in shaping their data so as not to be stuck in these algorithmic feedback loops? Okay, so these then are the specific questions of respect that I think we can ask about observation actions. So let's turn now to our next component, classification actions. And here I want to introduce a different example. We could go through this all with the same example, but I think it's more fun to have a few different ones to think about. So here I want us to think about pretrial risk assessment algorithms. So the sort of classification involved here is that we have a detainee that's been charged with a certain criminal offense. They're now at a pretrial assessment where we're trying to determine whether they should be released on bail. And we're going to use this algorithm to decide whether a detainee is at high risk of reoffending or not appearing in court. So that's what our algorithmic system is going to do. Now, let's first think about some of the problems with this classification action. So at the individual level, this algorithm may base its classification on proxies for protected classes. So, we might know that we don't want this algorithm to take into account data points like race and gender. So we might not, we can just exclude those from our data set entirely. But it may be the case that the algorithm is taking in some other data points, for example, zip code. And this might, this data point might serve as a proxy for a protected class. And thus the algorithm is, discriminating on the basis of a protected class in making its classification. And that's a key problem. Another problem here relatedly is that nowhere in this process is the detainee allowed to make a case for themselves, right? The classification is just made by the algorithmic system, and the detainee just has to live with that. Okay, actually don't want to get there yet. Another problem, if we think about this at the collective level, we might worry about how this classification may have disparate impacts, and that certain groups of people may be more readily classified as high risk than others. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, you might look at ProPublica's classic investigative report, Machine Bias, and their analysis of the Compass algorithm. So that's the worry we might have at the collective level, these disparate impacts. And again, we might worry that the communities affected here are not able to voice their concerns in these classifications. And lastly, at the iterative level, we again may worry that this classification may create a feedback loop. So if data from prior classifications are used to influence future classifications, this again is going to be the algorithm repeating itself. And again, another problem here is that the detainee cannot dispute this. Okay, so thinking now about the questions of respect that we should be asking, again, I'm going to lay out 4. So first, there's an overarching question, which is that are people able to dispute the classification that the algorithm makes? So obviously, they're not going to be maybe involved in the actual crunching of the numbers there, but within the algorithmic system, is there any opportunity for people to voice their concerns, whether at the individual, collective, or iterative level? And now zooming in on these different levels, so at the individual level, we need to ask, similarly to before, does this classification process respect each individual's rights? And here I think we need to be concerned particularly about people's rights to non-discrimination. At the collective level, we should ask, does this classification process treat all individuals fairly and equally? And at the iterative level, we need to ask, does this classification process allow individuals to take an active role in shaping their classification? And you might notice that these individual, collective, and iterative questions look very similar to the questions we saw on the last slide with observation actions. And that's no coincidence. I think the question of respect for each of these levels is shared across all these different components. And we'll see this again as I talk through our last component, this intervention action. And here now, let me introduce a third example. And here I want to just talk about targeted advertising. And so we should imagine that individuals, they have their browsing history observed, that data is being collected, then they're classified by the algorithmic system as falling into different user profiles. And then the intervention action is the actual showing of a particular ad to a user based on their user profile. So the algorithmic system classifies users as having certain interests, falling into certain demographics, and then what the intervention actually is the surfacing of a particular ad while they're searching based on that user profile. Okay, some of the problems here. So at the individual level, we could think, for example, about ads for anxiety and depression medication that target individuals who are identified to be at risk for anxiety and depression. Now, I think there's various concerns here about data collection and classification, but I think we also need to be concerned about how these individuals are particularly vulnerable and how this intervention of showing them an ad is particularly manipulative, right? So this action seems to fail to respect individuals because it is manipulating their vulnerabilities in showing them this ad. At the collective level, we could worry about cases where ads for high-paying jobs are being shown disproportionately to men over women. Because women have been deemed algorithmically to not have the right skills or background or whatever, even though this surely just corresponds to biases in the historical training data. Now, part of the problem here is that the intervention then further prohibits women from finding these kinds of jobs, right? So at the individual level, we might not worry that just one particular person is not shown an ad for this job. But when we think about how this plays out over the collective level, well, this then perpetuates inequities in the workplace by not showing certain ads to certain groups of people, and thus further prohibiting their access or just their awareness to those jobs. And at the iterative level, think about another example. Think about like fashion and beauty ads that present a very narrow and unobtainable standard of beauty. Now, seeing just one of these ads is probably not much of an issue, But seeing such ads again and again because an algorithm has decided that you're interested in fashion, well, this then can lead to negative thoughts about body image, about beauty standards. And even if a person decides that they don't want to see such ads anymore, they might not have the ability to influence what they're shown. Right? The algorithm may have just decided that, okay, we have classified you as falling into this relevant user profile, and so you will be seeing these ads from here on out. Okay, so the specific questions of respect that we want to be asking then. So the overarching question that I think we see played out in all of these examples I just went through, the overarching question is, are people able to act freely in response to the intervention that the algorithm makes? So we don't want the algorithm to manipulate people, to kind of get them stuck in certain patterns. People need to be able to act freely in response to what the algorithm is doing. At the individual level, we've got our similar question to before: does the intervention respect each individual's rights? And here, I think we might think particularly of the right to personal liberty. At the collective level, we can ask, okay, does the intervention treat all individuals fairly and equally? And at the iterative level, we can ask, does the intervention allow individuals to take an active role in shaping the intervention they experience? Okay, so I hope this is now giving you a sense of how this fundamental question of respect plays out across the different dimensions in our framework. And what I hope you can see is that there are 6 specific questions of respect, one each for each of our components and one for each of our levels. So these are things we've seen before. So for an observation action, the question of respect is, are people able to be aware of the data the algorithm is collecting? For classifications, the question is, are people able to dispute the classification the algorithm makes? And for intervention actions, the question is, are people able to act freely in response to the algorithm's intervention? And at the different levels, at the individual level, the question is, does the action respect each individual's rights? At the collective level, the question is, does the action treat all individuals fairly and equally? And at the iterative level, the question is, does the action allow individuals to take an active role in shaping the action? So these are the specific questions of respect that I think we need to be asking of any algorithmic system. And one of the kind of neat things that falls out of this framework is that each of these questions of respect promotes a different ideal. And these ideals are precisely those ideals we saw way back at the start of this presentation. So, respect for persons, that is to say, promotes different ideals for each component and level. So respect for persons for observation actions promotes transparency. For classifications, it promotes giving individuals a voice in their classification. For intervention actions, it promotes individuals' autonomy. At the individual level, respect for persons promotes rights. At the collective level, it promotes fairness and justice. And at the iterative level, it again promotes autonomy. And this is just how those questions that we saw in the previous slide relate to different ethical ideals. And so what we can see is that respect for persons underlies a lot of the various ideals that we care most about in algorithmic systems. And this is why I think it's such a helpful heuristic, because from just one question, we can understand various ethical ideals that we want to promote. Okay, so we're coming near the end of this presentation. So I want to finally just kind of put it all together and show you at least how I envision this framework being put into practice. And the basic process here is that we use this matrix, these different components and levels of algorithmic actions, and these various questions of respect to identify ethical problem areas, and then come up with ways to respond to each of these problematic actions. And so here's how this might play out. So here again is our 3x3 matrix. I've now filled it out a bit more, so we don't only have, we have not only our different components and levels, but I've also listed out the various questions of respect that we want to be thinking about. And so what we'd want to do with this matrix now is just go through each cell one by one and ask the relevant questions of respect. So we can start with our individual observation actions. You can ask, okay, are people able to be aware of the data the algorithm is collecting at the individual level? And does the action, this observation action, respect each individual's rights? And in this example, we might think, okay, we're actually doing good on this component at this level. And then we go on to the next level. And here we might think, okay, here there's some problem points. In some respect, our algorithmic system is not treating individuals fairly and equally in how it collects their data. And then we go through all the rest. And what we end up with is, our matrix now we've identified some of the problematic areas. And now we can focus on just those problematic areas and come up with responses. So the idea here would be use the matrix to identify these problem areas and then focus on those problem areas and come up with ways to respond. Now, here's where the framework might seem a bit disappointing, because you might be wondering, okay, well, how do we respond to each of these problem areas? How do we, fix it when we have an issue with a collective observation or, an iterative intervention? So here I have to tell you that there are no universal responses. And go back now to the start of this presentation when I was talking about how with these design choices, there are no kind of single universal responses that will work for each and every use case. Now that shouldn't worry us, as I said at the start. And in fact, although there are no universal responses, there are a plurality of possible responses. And the key thing here is to use this framework to at least get you to make some response to address these problems. And to just go through a couple examples. So imagine we have a problem in collective observation. So the data that the algorithm takes in does not treat all groups of people fairly and equally. What could we do in response to this? Well, one option would be to just eliminate that data point. So not make that part of our algorithmic system anymore. But another response would be to collect more data to do a better job of treating individuals, groups of individuals fairly and equally. Another option would be to, in some way, debias the data and use techniques for that. The point here is not that any of these particular actions is better or worse than any other, but to just emphasize that there are a number of different responses, and which one we choose is going to depend on our particular use case and what's really feasible, what makes sense for what we're doing. So this is all to reiterate and reemphasize that the response you're going to make, there is no one single universal answer here. The response you make will always depend on your use case. Okay, so to sum up, to wrap up, for putting this framework into practice, there's a few different steps. So you first analyze your algorithm into its component actions. You start breaking it apart into those observations, classifications, and interventions. Then you go through the matrix, you ask those various questions of respect, and you use those questions to identify the problematic actions of your algorithmic system. Then once those problematic areas are identified, you then want to formulate a response to each and every one of them. Then incorporate these responses into your algorithm's design, and finally communicate these responses both to your team and possibly more broadly to the public. And ideally, all of these steps should be done collaboratively. I mean, you could do them all on your own, but I think, as we all know, work like this always goes better when multiple people are working together. And ultimately, I hope that a framework like this could be productively incorporated into the algorithmic design workflow or lifecycle. So ultimately, I'd like this framework to be seen kind of alongside practices of code review, of pair programming, team presentations. This should be just another way in which we evaluate each other's work. These sorts of questions are questions that we need to be asking of any algorithmic system to evaluate whether it's good or not. Now, that being said, I'll admit that this is all a work in progress. And part of the reason I'm here is to hear your feedback and learn more about what you think. So with that, I'll wrap up. I'll say thank you. Here is, again, my contact information. I'll also say if you want a copy of these slides to go through some of the questions in the framework more slowly on your own, I have posted them already to my website, and you can see the address there. But thanks again. I hope you've enjoyed this, and I'll leave things there.
Hey, thanks a lot, Willie. I think this was pretty eye-opening. I think I had a audience who said today's topic is mind-blowing. It's a completely different direction of AI. So I think people were pretty engaged in terms of their. So one question, I think there are any questions. If anybody has, please feel free to post them in the chat. I can help you ask that to Willie. And while that's being posted up, one of the questions which I had, you kind of talked about the data collection itself and what actions users have, but traditionally we have seen in the past is the ethics and the biases really came about because there was no data there in the first place, right? So how is that angle kind of taken into account while kind of thinking about ethics in the first place?
Yeah, so you're thinking of a case where, did you say there isn't data in the first place?
Yes. So, for example, right, I mean, Amazon kind of keeps coming up, and not to kind of take their case itself, but, one of their algorithmic thing was, how they kind of looked at the internal resumes of those things. And, it kind of started recommending all male candidates in there. Then, when they wanted to determine, hey, how they want to kind of set up one day delivery in which neighborhoods, the low income neighborhoods were kind of ruled out because they never probably they never had ordered from Amazon in those places. You had the browsing history itself, right? And when I look at it from a context of India, right, if I look at a browsing history, a person with low income or no income would never kind of feature into those things, right? So in that sense, even though I've kind of taken care of that whole framework, those biases still come into play, right? So how do I kind of balance those things as we go along?
Yeah, so I think you're talking about cases where there are certain blind spots in our data, which might not be apparent until the algorithmic system is deployed, right? So we didn't see, for whatever reason, that our training data was kind of biased against women applicants, and now once we deploy this hiring algorithm, we see these disparate results. Yeah, I mean, I think this framework can still help with that stuff, in particular in how it kind of asks us to think more broadly about how our data is being collected, how it might be used to classify people. And so, especially thinking about these questions at the collective level, like even if certain people might not appear in our data, once we kind of get accustomed to asking these collective level questions, we should be thinking about these different major groups of people. So we need to be thinking about people of different genders, of different races, of different access to, like, levels of access to the internet, all of these different things. And this, we should be thinking about these things as part of the design process. And, I think one of the things that the framework can help us identify is, by encouraging us to ask those questions, at the design level, we can start thinking about, okay, well, let's think about how our data, what we're observing, let's think about how that may not treat all individuals fairly and equally, given that it seems that certain individuals are not even in our data, and how are we going to deal with that? So I'd hope that this framework could help kind of bring our attention to these problems earlier on, so we don't have to wait until the system's actually deployed, but can start thinking about these things initially as we're designing the system.
Got it. I think one participant, Philip, had quite a few comments, so I'm just going to read it out for you. I think when you kind of talked about loan applications earlier in your slides, as far as I know, adverse action notices are typically required for financial providers in the US. to
Mm-hmm.
kind of explain why loan applications are denied. So
Mm-hmm.
the regulatory angle is also important. Any
Absolutely.
Okay.
No, I think that's really essential. Yeah. And this is why I was talking about that AI ethics ecosystem. I think one of the reasons that we see kind of better practices sometimes in terms of loan applications, sort of like banking algorithms, things like that. These are insurance algorithms. These are heavily regulated industries. And so, they already have a higher bar in terms of what they need to do.
Hmm. Again, Philip was kind of talking about this is about the trolley problems. For example, affirmative action driven by fairness interventions may improve outcomes for the underprivileged groups, but recommendation algorithms like Netflix, Amazon have access to historic choices of the users. So can this be addressed using the ethical design framework?
Um, can what be addressed? I want to make sure.
So he's talking about affirmative actions, the trolley problems. Probably when you have access to data versus not access to data. The question probably that I posed previously. So for example, he says that um, you know improve outcomes for the unprivileged group, but recommendation algorithms have access to historical choices, which could have evolved over a period of time, right? So, how does that kind of fall into the ethical design framework?
Okay. I'm not totally certain I'm still getting the question, but a couple things that just jumped to my mind. So one thing I want to emphasize is that there's very different uses and responses that we can choose to make when designing an algorithmic system. So I don't want to suggest that there's like only only kind of one way to respect persons or to respond to these problems of especially fairness, equality, and equity. So I do think that there's some room for debate about what we want our algorithmic system to do, whether we want to use it to serve like the historically underprivileged, or whether we want it to rather focus on other factors, um, and whatever treats individuals more like just as all alike in that way.
Mhm.
I think those are actually two different ways of respecting people and promoting fairness. So I think there's just still room for debate about what we actually want that to look like. Um, but I think like there should be room for debate about that. Like that's a real ethical design decision. And what I hope like what I hope the framework helps us do is ask those questions in the first place and start to have those discussions with our team, with the public, because if nothing else, we need to be explicit in what we mean by fairness, what we're trying to achieve to promote fairness, and to be explicit so that we can talk about that more and really have a discussion.
Got it. Because Philip actually kind of made some points in there, which are kind of pretty thought provoking. So he's saying that when you kind of
Mm-hmm.
make it better for some people, does it become worse for others in that sense, right? So I think uh, that's where he was talking about the underprivileged groups as well, where you don't have that data, but when you try to fix that, does it kind of mess it somewhere else as well, right? So it's kind of linking back to
Yeah.
your accuracy problem before.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is just inevitable with algorithmic systems, right? Like, I mean, algorithmic systems by their design discriminate. Now, they don't necessarily discriminate on the basis of like protected classes or other bad features, but we're trying to make a discriminatory decision to classify individuals or whatever images as belonging to one class and not another. We're trying to sift out things and put things into different groups. So I think what we need to be clear about is, okay, how are we making this discriminatory decision? And again, I mean discrimination here in a completely neutral sense. In particular, I mean, I think we should ask these questions so that we can be more sure that we're not having our algorithm make these actions in a problematically discriminatory way. So I
Got it.
think that the fact that certain people are going to be um, classed in this way and certain people in another, that's just an inevitable feature of algorithmic systems. And again, the idea here is to make our design choices more explicit and make the ethics of those design choices more explicit so that they can become a point for discussion.
Got it. There's one more question from Jeremy. Hi, Jeremy. In the organizations, do you support ethical review boards, training anyone, or external reviews? Right? How would you kind of approach this area?
Yeah, so again, this kind of comes back to the AI ethics ecosystem question. I do think this needs to be, this sort of ethical design talk needs to be promoted at various different levels. In particular, I do think, so review boards makes a lot of sense. I don't know if those should necessarily be internal. Like, I don't think ethics should be kind of siloed off, where it's just like at some point in the pipeline, the system goes to the ethics board, and they give their stamp or don't. I do think there can be productive external auditing systems, and that's a better check. But more than that, yeah, like training for everyone, really getting everyone to be part of this practice, I think is really key. And so part of what that's going to require is regular training, like part of onboarding, part of continual training. But I think more than that, it's fostering a culture where this is part of the practice. And so I do really, I said this at the end of the presentation, I would really like to see this sort of ethical design thinking to be kind of something that a company or a team does just like they do code review. And this should be just part of good practice of building your team and making sure you're doing good work. And so that's what this framework is designed to do, is to give people a way of approaching that task in a more structured way. And so that they can know better how to ask the right questions, how to think through the various issues, and then to actually have these discussions about the ethics of their algorithmic system design.
I think that that framework of yours, I'm going to kind of keep that as a cover page. I think that kind of justifies how this is there, and I think a lot of pretty insightful areas to think about. Something that even I hadn't thought about. So yeah, really appreciate how you shared some of these. It looks simple, and how you kind of linked it into, hey, this is how the data scientists kind of use that on a regular basis. So. Any other questions from the audiences? I think people loved your topic, and I think I will let you go. Thank you,
All
Willie.
right. Well,
Thanks a lot.
thanks again. Again, if you want to see these slides, go to my website, and I am going to keep working on this framework. So keep an eye on my website or follow me on LinkedIn or Twitter. As I update it, as I come out with new iterations, I'll be promoting it there. So thanks so much, everyone. I love the questions, and yeah, thanks again.
Thank you very much, Willie. I know it's pretty early in the morning for you, but thanks for making time for this part of the world. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Happy to
See you
join
guys.
you.
See you guys next Tuesday with more of bot framework. Thanks, Willie.